Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to another in our series of double shot interviews where we talk to someone interesting, a minister or a politician about something interesting. And Russel Norman is here, the co-leader of the Greens Party, 3 days out before the election, and the Greens are looking stronger in the polls. Could you be in government in a few days' time?
Well, I certainly hope so. We'd be good in government.
What would you ask for, though, if National or Labour came calling? What would be your first off-the-rank things to ask for?
During this campaign, we said what you campaign on should be the things that you ask for in post-election negotiations. So clean rivers, kids out of poverty, green jobs was our top three priorities. There's a kind of a group of secondary priorities underneath that as well that we've talked about. But yeah, that'd be our top three. So how much would they cost, those top three? So if you look at the Clean Rivers one, for example, we're raising it with an irrigation levy of 10 cents per cubic metre, 10 cents per 1,000 litres. You'd raise between $370 and $570 million a year, and so we would spend about 140 of that per year on remediation. And so we'd have some surplus which we could use to either pay down debt or basically replace other kinds of tax, because the whole idea of green tax reform is you take taxes off wages and companies and you put them on pollution and resource use. So that would be the cost around that one.
When you say remediation, what does that mean?
So what we're saying is that if you look at one of the ways you can start to clean up rivers is stock access, and so that means fencing and planting. So you can fence and plant. We've got a big program of fencing and planting. Now, it should be clear that that deals with the immediate issues around waterways of stock getting in and the sediment and the phosphorus that's attached to sediment, and of course the feces and urine when they're in the river. But in terms of the nitrogen going through the groundwater, that's to do with intensification rather than stock getting into water. And so we'd also put in place a set of rules around intensive agriculture, because currently it's unregulated. And so that doesn't have a cost in terms of a fiscal implication, but clearly there will be a significant piece of work to do to get those rules in place.
Farmers would say that might damage their output, exports and hurt the economy.
Well, farmers might say that, and dairy corporations will say that even more. But when you ask people, why does New Zealand get access to markets overseas and why do we get a premium on our produce, it's because it's seen as clean, green and safe. Currently we are absolutely trashing our rivers and lakes because of intensive agriculture, and in the long run we will lose clean, green and safe if we continue to trash our environment.
Now the other one of those other three is child poverty. What are you planning there?
Probably the biggest spending item is around extending what's called the in-work tax credit to beneficiary families. So when Labor set up Working for Families, they said we want to penalise beneficiaries and their children, so they won't get the extra $60 a week you get if you've got a job. We said, look, you might not agree with the parents, but because they're out of work. But even if you accept that argument, why punish the kids? So we think supporting children with money, so that they get a decent start in life, is a worthwhile investment. That would cost around $300 million a year, so it's not cheap. But I think alleviating child poverty, there's 270,000 kids in poverty in New Zealand, would actually be a great investment in our future.
So what about the other spending areas?
So in terms of, say, green jobs, we've got some programs which are what you might call using taxes to buy jobs kind of programs. So that's like the home insulation scheme. You'd extend it for another 200,000 homes. We've done 120,000. It's a great scheme. You get 3-to-1 return because of the savings in the health system from ill health, people being sick. And so we'd extend it to another 200,000 homes, so we could do that for about $300 million. And then the other one is the riparian fencing and planting, which generates a lot of jobs. But the really ambitious stuff is around the state-owned enterprises and thinking about them as basically a base for an export sector in clean technology. So we want to say, look, these energy companies have got expertise in renewable energy, rapidly growing sector of the global economy, one of the few. They've got a certain critical mass in terms of capital, and they've already started. Some of them are exporting already. Mighty River Power is exporting a fair bit of geothermal technology. But we want to actually get them to work together, but also to partner with private sector entrepreneurs. So, Bill English wants to partially privatise them for a mixed ownership model. We say use them as a core for an export sector, a base, and then get them to partner with the private sector. because we think that's a much better model.
So that's some of the spending areas. What about taxation? Although you've talked about some of the pollution tax stuff.
Yeah, so in terms of taxation, we've obviously long advocated a capital gains tax excluding the family home. We've clocked that at $1 billion over 3 years, but you could debate, obviously, ad infinitum what it would be at. And it depends on what happens with asset prices and how the capital gains tax is structured. Ours is a bit different to Labor's. It's put at marginal tax rates.
Why not go for a land tax?
Well, we've discussed a land tax in the party at some length, but decided to stick with capital gains tax right now. We'll look at it again post-election, but there are some complications around the impacts of land tax and the incentives then to intensify land use, which you don't always necessarily want. But there's an argument around a land tax, I accept that. The other one in terms of increased taxes, if you want me to talk about that, is obviously the earthquake levy. So we've promoted that all along. Let's pay for the rebuild of Christchurch by people who can afford it paying a little bit extra. We've all just, high income earners have all just had a big tax cut. We wouldn't even take all of that back. As a temporary targeted levy to pay for the rebuild rather than borrowing, because in the international climate we're in at the moment, borrowing lots and lots of money isn't a great
What
position.
about income taxes?
So the earthquake levy has an effect on income taxes. So basically the top tax rate would increase 3% on a temporary targeted basis. Our policy is for a much more progressive taxation system, but in terms of our priorities, which is what our whole fiscal implications is based on, we haven't incorporated that in our numbers because we think in a post-election negotiation that's probably not what we're going to get. So we've actually just focused on the areas that these priority areas that we think we can get.
So those priority areas, what is the net effect on the budget? Would you get back into surplus earlier or later than what the government and National are saying?
So what we did was, the net effect is that we raise, if you like, $8 billion, and that's not just increased taxes, that's cuts as well, because we'd cut the motorway building program because it's just insanely expensive. $20 billion over 10 years is an insane amount of money to spend on new motorways. So we'd save money there, and we'd also save money in terms of subsidies for greenhouse emissions. So National obviously want to subsidise greenhouse emissions massively. We think that's a bad idea. But when you put all that together, that is the increased tax take plus the cuts in other areas, it's about $8 billion over 3 years. And then on the increased cost side, it's about $4 billion over 3 years. So you end up $4 billion ahead, but it should be said that this doesn't cover everything. So obviously there's other cost pressures on government other than our priorities, and that's things like just inflation coming out of health and education. So we've left some fiscal kind of leverage there so that we can actually account for the other stuff.
Now, the Greens have a view on the Reserve Bank Act and how monetary policy should be run. What's your view?
Well, we've long advocated that, particularly when we went through the housing asset bubble, that we should target the inflation coming out of the housing asset bubble specifically, rather than using the OCR and hence interest rates as an attempt to try to squash inflation more generally. And so that was things like a capital gains tax to try to target that inflation. It was like the tax treatment of investment properties more generally. And it was also like using loan to valuation ratios targeted at the housing sector if we've got a problem of a housing asset inflation, right? And now that's not the number one problem we've got right now, but potentially Auckland's looking a little bit dicey about what's happening with Auckland property prices, and I think the Reserve Bank should be watching that very closely. But so we think that you should use measures that target the actual problems rather than trying to smother the whole economy with a high interest rate policy, which of course then drove up the New Zealand dollar, basically threatened the entire tradable sector. It came under enormous pressure because of that policy. So that's kind of looking backwards, if you like, for the problems we've had. And we've been advocating a change in focus in terms of the Reserve Bank for a decade, I guess.
What would that mean in practice, though? How would the Reserve Bank translate that into policy?
So it means that, for example, part of it is things the Reserve Bank can do and part of it isn't. So, like, for example, the tax treatment of investment properties is more about government policy than Reserve Bank policy. But in terms of loan to valuation ratios, what the Reserve Bank could do is say to the trading banks, you can't give out 100% housing mortgages. They've got to have 20% deposit or whatever. Very common practice internationally. And so that's trying to restrict the lending into the housing sector if we saw another housing asset bubble develop.
Now, around the world, governments and central banks are quantitatively easing, which is another word for money printing, to try and boost their economies. Now, our official cash rate's still 2.5%. It's got a way to be cut, and we're nowhere near those sorts of unconventional measures yet. But what's your view on using them?
Well, like you say, we've still got a bit of space on OCR, and that gives us certain advantages. We also have, the Australasian banking system. One might, and we do complain about the Australian banks essentially taking $2 billion a year out of our economy, but the Australasian banking system is still relatively stable. But it's certainly true that down the track there could be need to use unconventional measures, and like every other central bank, the New Zealand Reserve Bank will need to look at it. Now, whether that takes the form of, they actually did a little bit of it with the allowing the banks to use their home mortgages as deposits essentially to get more money from the Reserve Bank. So they did do a little bit of unconventional stuff during the GFC, though they kept it very, very quiet. But the other kind of unconventional thing they could do would be for the Reserve Bank to basically buy government debt. So if the government's going into the international market and if it were struggling to raise it, that's one way to deal with it. That is a roundabout way of quantitative easing.
Why not do that now? Because you've got 2 or 3 years more of borrowing, and most of it, or a good chunk of it's borrowing from offshore, raising New Zealand's foreign debt. Why doesn't the Reserve Bank, under a National Green Coalition, be asked to buy those government bonds?
Well, we've when the Governor of the Reserve Bank's been in front of the Finance and Expenditure Committee, I've certainly been raising some of the unconventional stuff that other central bankers have been doing, and the Reserve Bank Governor is not very comfortable with that, which I guess is part of his job description. What we're doing as the Greens is trying to push the barrow or push the boat out in terms of let's have that conversation about what unconventional central bank action would look like. There's other stuff as well. I mean, for example, the Swiss have done very interesting things in terms of trying to put a lid on their currency. I mean, the Swiss Central Bank basically said, if our currency goes any higher, we're going to start printing francs, which was actually worked. I mean, it kept the Swiss franc down. So there are some other interesting unconventional stuff around trying to put a lid on the currency as well that I think that we should be discussing.
Russell Norman there, the co-leader of the Greens, a few days out from the election. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was another in our series of double-shot interviews for interest.co.nz.